Sure, I'd heard the stories, every old hospital has them, but I was a man of science. Psychology, specifically. I studied the mind, its fractures, and the way trauma could make reality distort. I had no interest in urban legends. And yet, I can't explain what happened to me that night. St. Daria Hospital had stood for over a century, its stone facade weathered by time and neglect. When I first arrived, the air smelled of antiseptic and something older. Something musty, like faded memories trapped in the walls. Did anyone tell you about Ward 13 yet? Asked Dr. Patel, one of the senior physicians, during my orientation. I chuckled. Let me guess, haunted? A few of the nurses exchanged glances. No joke, Sokolov, Patel said. Back in the 70s, a fire broke out there. Whole wing went up in minutes. Thing is, when the flames died down, there were no bodies, no remains, nothing. They evacuated? I asked, but even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Fires leave something behind, bones, ash, something. No one really knows, Patel said. Officially, Ward 13 doesn't exist anymore. They walled it off after the fire. No records. No explanations. It was just another ghost story, I told myself. But something about the way Patel said it, his voice low, serious, made the hairs on my arms rise. I put it out of my mind. Until that night. It was my first overnight shift, and the hospital was quieter than I'd ever seen it. The hall stretched emptily before me, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The only sounds were the distant beeping of heart monitors and the occasional murmur of a nurse at the reception desk. Then the intercom crackled. A weak, trembling voice whispered through the old system. Help me. I froze. The sound was distorted, like a radio signal struggling to come through. Who is this? I asked, stepping closer to the speaker on the wall. Static. Then, a wheezing breath. Please help. My skin prickled. I grabbed the nearest computer and pulled up the internal call records. My breath caught in my throat. The call had come from Ward 13, a ward that wasn't supposed to exist, a ward that had been sealed off for decades. And then, from down the hall, a door creaked open. I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door at the end of the hall, one I was sure had been closed just minutes ago, now stood ajar, a sliver of darkness yawning beyond it. A draft curled through, carrying with it a faint, charred smell, like burnt wood and something fouler beneath it. For a long moment, I just stood there, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe a nurse had left it open. Maybe it was the ventilation system creating pressure shifts. Maybe. But I kept thinking about that voice. Please help. I swallowed hard and checked the call records again. It wasn't a mistake. The system had traced the transmission back to Ward 13. But that was impossible. I reached for my radio. Nurse station, this is Dr. Sokolov. Did anyone else hear that call just now? Silence. Then a crackle of static. Call doctor? A voice finally answered. It was Maria, the night nurse. No, we haven't received anything. Is everything all right? I hesitated. If they hadn't heard it. Had I imagined it? Yeah, I said slowly. I just thought I heard something. I'll check it out. I clicked off the radio before she could ask more questions. The smart thing to do would be to forget it. To turn around, finish my rounds, and chalk it up to exhaustion playing tricks on me. Instead, I found myself walking toward the open door. The hallway beyond was dark, the overhead lights long since dead. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing a space that looked untouched for decades. The walls were yellowed with age, the linoleum cracked and curling. Faint scorch marks crept up the edges of the ceiling, remnants of the fire that had supposedly consumed this place. The air was thick, damp, as if time itself had congealed here. I took a cautious step forward. And then a noise, a soft shuffle somewhere deeper in the hall. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs. Hello, I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the stale air. Nothing. I took another step, scanning the corridor. The old room numbers were still bolted to the doors, some rusted, others missing. Most of the rooms were shut, but up ahead one door was slightly ajar. Room 1313. And then the intercom crackled again. Still burning. A whisper, barely audible. I spun, my breath catching. There was no intercom in this hallway. No speakers. No power. And yet the voice was there. Closer this time. Behind me. I turned and something moved in the dark. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I swung it toward the movement. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something. A shape just beyond the reach of the light. A figure hunched and motionless, lingering near the far end of the corridor. And then it was gone. My breath hitched. The logical part of my mind screamed for an explanation. Shadows, fatigue, a trick of the dim light. But deep down, something primal stirred. I wasn't alone. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. The silence stretched unbearably, filled only by the distant hum of the hospital beyond this forgotten place. I forced myself forward, each step measured, cautious. Room 1313 loomed ahead, its door slightly open. A sliver of darkness seeped from the gap, like ink bleeding onto the floor. I reached for the handle. My fingers brushed against the wood, ice cold, as if the door had been left outside in the dead of winter. Something was wrong. I swallowed and pushed it open. The room inside was a ruin. The walls were scorched black, peeling in long, jagged strips. The bed frame was little more than twisted metal, half melted by the fire that had raged here decades ago. The smell of burnt flesh, long since faded from the rest of the hospital, still clung to this place, sickly sweet and suffocating. But what made my blood run cold was the chair in the center of the room. It was upright, untouched by fire, as if someone had placed it there long after the disaster. A thick layer of dust coated the seat, except for the imprint of a single hand, pressed deep into the fabric. Fresh. I stepped closer, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. And then I saw it. In the dust on the wall, just behind the chair, someone had dragged their fingers through the grime, leaving behind a single, desperate word. Help. My mouth went dry. A gust of air whispered past me, icy breath against my neck. I spun around. Nothing. But then, the lights in the corridor flickered. The intercom crackled, hissing with static. And from deep within the hospital's forgotten ward, a voice, closer now, whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A shadow moved at the doorway, and the door slammed shut. I lunged for the door. My hands slammed against the wood, rattling the rusted handle. Locked. The flashlight's beam danced wildly as I turned, scanning the ruined room. My breath came fast, shallow. The air was thick with dust, but something else lurked beneath it. A burning smell, fresh, like the fire had only just been here. Then a sound behind me, a slow, deliberate scrape, like something shifting. I whipped around, light cutting across the chair. The handprint was gone. A chill coiled in my stomach. I knew it had been there. I'd seen it. Then another noise, a faint tapping. It was coming from the wall, the one with the words scratched into the dust. Help. The sound was steady, rhythmic tap, like fingers drumming against the inside of the wall. I swallowed hard. The room was supposed to be empty. It had been sealed for decades. And yet, something was on the other side. Then the tapping stopped. Silence pressed in. I barely had a second to process it before the wall slammed from the other side. A brutal, shuddering impact. The entire room seemed to shake. Dust rained down. My pulse pounded in my skull as I stumbled backward. Another slam. Harder. Then, a crack splintered through the old, blackened wall. Something was pushing through. I scrambled for my radio. "This is Dr. Sokolov. I need help. I'm in." Static swallowed my voice. And then, the intercom crackled again. The whispering voice had changed. No longer weak. No longer pleading. This time it was angry. "You were not supposed to find us." The door behind me burst open, and the corridor outside was no longer empty. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. The corridor beyond the door was no longer the abandoned ruin I had stepped into. It was alive. The overhead lights, dead for decades, now flickered with a sickly yellow glow. The floor, once cracked and covered in dust, gleamed with fresh linoleum. The scent of antiseptic and something metallic, blood, hung heavy in the air. And the hallway was no longer empty. Figures stood there. At first they didn't move. Just shadows, barely distinct from the flickering darkness around them. My flashlight sputtered, and for the briefest moment, I saw them clearly. Patients. Or at least they had been. Their hospital gowns hung in scorched tatters. Their skin was blackened, peeling, raw. Some had no faces at all. Just hollow, gaping voids where eyes and mouths should be. And then, as one, they turned toward me. The nearest figure, a woman with half her face melted away, opened her mouth. But there was no sound. Not at first. Then, a whisper slithered through the air. Not from her lips, but from everywhere. Burning? Still burning. The lights above me exploded. Darkness swallowed the hall. I bolted. My footsteps pounded against the floor as I sprinted, lungs seizing against the heavy air. I didn't know where I was running, only that I had to get out. Behind me, shuffling footsteps dragged after me. Slow but relentless. The hallway twisted, impossibly long. The walls shimmered, warping like heat rising from pavement. Ahead, a door. The exit? No, an office. I didn't care. I threw myself against it, fingers scrabbling at the handle. Turned. I fell inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Darkness. Silence. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for my phone, shaking fingers switching on the flashlight. The room was small, cramped. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal rusted. A single wooden desk sat in the center, covered in papers long yellowed with age. And there, atop the desk, lay an old leather-bound journal. My heart lurched. I stepped closer. The cover was cracked, the spine barely holding together. I opened it. The first few pages were filled with patient notes, scrawled in fading ink. But the further I flipped, the stranger the entries became. And then, on the last page, February 12, 1974, the day of the fire. A single sentence had been written there, the ink dark, fresh, as if it had been written just moments ago. They never left. A breath. Asterisk asterisk not my own. Asterisk asterisk whispered against my ear. I turned. The door slowly creaked open, and standing just beyond the threshold was someone waiting for me. The figure stood just beyond the doorway, unmoving. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam struggling to cut through the darkness. At first, I thought it was one of the burned patients from the corridor, one of the things that had been chasing me. But as the light steadied, I saw it wasn't. This person, if they could even be called that, wore a tattered doctor's coat, singed at the edges, the fabric dark with stains I didn't want to identify. Their head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if their neck had been broken and never properly set. And their face, it was wrong. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but blurred, like melted wax. The eyes were black, hollow pits, yet I could feel them staring into me. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed to move, to escape. But my legs wouldn't obey. The figure raised a hand. Long fingers, unnaturally thin, trembled as they reached toward me. And then they spoke. A voice like crackling fire, layered with something deep, guttural. You are not supposed to be here. The lights buzzed violently. The walls around me shuddered. The room seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing. And then a sound, a chorus of voices, not just one, dozens. Still burning, still burning, still burning. The whispers bled together, swelling to a deafening roar. The room grew hotter, suffocating. And suddenly I felt it, heat, searing, crawling up my skin. The air thickened with the stench of charred flesh, and when I looked down at my arms, blisters were forming, like I was standing in the middle of the fire that had consumed this place. I stumbled back, my body screaming in pain, and the journal slipped from my hands. The figure's head snapped toward it. Their melted, waxen face twisted. And then, They lunged. I threw myself backward, just as the thing screeched, an inhuman wail that rattled the very walls. The lights exploded, and everything went dark. Darkness swallowed me whole. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. No sight, no sound, just an empty void pressing in from all sides. My breath came in ragged gasps, the lingering heat still crawling over my skin. Then, a whisper, right beside my ear. "Run!" My body finally obeyed. I bolted. My flashlight was dead, my phone useless in my grip, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to move. The office door swung open as I crashed through it, back into the warped corridor of Ward 13. But it wasn't the same. The hospital had changed. The hallway stretched impossibly long, curving in ways that defied logic. Doors lined the walls, too many doors. Some gaped open, revealing glimpses of rooms that shouldn't be there. Charred hospital beds, walls smeared with black handprints, and figures, watching. Their hollow eyes tracked me as I ran past. And then, the alarms started blaring. A shrill, gut-wrenching sound. The same emergency sirens that must have filled this place the night it burned. Red emergency lights flickered to life, painting the walls in flashes of blood. I turned a corner and stopped cold. At the far end of the hallway, something was waiting for me. A silhouette, standing motionless beneath the flickering red light. First, I thought it was another doctor. Their coat was white, too white, untouched by the grime and decay around them. But then they moved, not walking, gliding. And as they neared, I saw what was wrong. There was nothing beneath the coat. No face, no body, just an empty void where a person should have been. And then, all the doors in the hallway burst open. Hands, blackened, burned, shot out from the rooms, clawing, reaching for me. I had nowhere to go. Behind me, the corridor stretched into darkness, twisting, warping. Ahead, the faceless doctor drifted closer. And the voices, hundreds of them, whispered in unison. "You were not supposed to find us." The faceless figure raised a hand. I felt my body burning again. And then, the floor collapsed beneath me. I plunged into the dark. I was falling. The air rushed past me, thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning flesh. My stomach lurched, and for a brief, horrifying second, I thought I would never stop, that I would plummet into some endless abyss beneath the hospital. But then, impact. I crashed onto cold, wet tiles. Pain exploded through my body, knocking the breath from my lungs. I lay there, dazed, trying to process where I was. The air was different down here, heavier, damp. The faint scent of mildew mingled with something sickly sweet, something rotten. I groaned, pushing myself up, my palms slipping against the slick tiles. My flashlight was gone. My phone, cracked but still clutched in my trembling fingers, barely flickered to life. A dim glow illuminated my surroundings. A morgue. I barely had time to register it before I heard it. A wet, shuffling sound. My pulse jackhammered. I turned my phone's light toward the noise. The first thing I saw were the body drawers. Dozens of them lined the walls, their metal doors rusted and dented. Some were still sealed shut, but others had been forced open. The nearest gurney was empty, but the sheet draped over it was stained. Something had crawled out. Another shuffle. Closer this time. I turned, my light sweeping across the morgue floor. A footprint, wet, smudged with something dark, and leading toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. And then, from one of the open body drawers, a hand slid out. Blackened fingers gripped the metal edge, pulling. Slowly, deliberately, something was climbing out. And as the shadows shifted, I realized it was looking at me, even though its eyes were nothing but burned-out hollows. Even though it shouldn't be alive. It saw me. Then, in the silence, a second hand. The third. Too many hands. They clawed out from the darkness of the morgue drawers, skeletal fingers dragging charred bodies into the flickering light. A chorus of whispers rose. "Still burning. Still burning." I scrambled backward. Something behind me breathed, Close. I turned, and the corpse on the gurney sat up. The corpse sat up slowly. Its skin, if it could still be called that, was blackened and split, flaking away in charred layers. Where its eyes should have been, there was nothing. Just empty, cavernous sockets staring straight into me. And then, it breathed. A ragged, wheezing sound, thick with something wet, something rotten. I couldn't move. My legs locked, my body refusing to obey as the thing on the gurney twisted its head toward me. Then, it spoke. Not with its mouth. The lips never moved. The voice came from everywhere. Help me. The same voice I had heard over the intercom. The same voice that had lured me here. Behind me, the other corpses stirred, shifting, crawling from the morgue drawers, from the shadows. Their bodies twisted unnaturally, bones cracking as they dragged themselves forward. I bolted. I didn't care where I was running. I just had to get out. My feet pounded against the tile as I sprinted for the nearest door. My fingers fumbled for the handle, locked. No, no, no. A rasping breath wheezed behind me. I turned just in time to see the first corpse lurch from the gurney. I threw myself at the second door. It gave. I stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. Darkness. The only light came from my cracked phone screen, flickering weakly. I turned, breath ragged, and froze. I was back in the hospital. No, not St. Daria as I knew it. This was St. Daria as it had been. Before the fire. The walls were pristine. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a dim glow over the polished floors. The smell of antiseptic was fresh, clean. The hospital was alive. But something was wrong. The hallway stretched out endlessly. And I was not alone. Figures in old hospital gowns shuffled aimlessly. Doctors in crisp white coats drifted between rooms. And yet, no one acknowledged me. It was as if they couldn't see me at all. Or worse, as if they knew I was there but refused to look. Then, from the far end of the hallway, the faceless doctor stepped into view. Waiting, watching, and then, the hospital began to burn. I was dying. The fire wrapped around me, curling through my lungs, scorching my skin. My body screamed for air, for escape, but there was none. I was sinking, falling deeper into the past, into the fire that had never truly gone out. And standing just beyond the flames, watching me burn, was him, the faceless doctor, the man who had started it all. I saw it now, the truth hidden beneath decades of silence. The fire wasn't an accident. It was a purge, a locked ward, patients forgotten, deemed too broken to be saved. No evacuations, no survivors, and he was the one who had lit the match. The fire had erased Ward 13 from history, but not from existence. The ones who had burned never left. They were still here, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering, reliving their final moments. Waiting for someone like me to stumble in, to take my place among them. No, a desperate surge of survival ripped through me. I wasn't going to die here. I refused. With everything I had left, I forced myself forward, tearing free from the flames. My hands burned, my skin peeling, but I didn't stop. The hospital around me was collapsing, walls warping, the past and present bleeding together. I ran. The faceless doctor watched me go. But he didn't follow, because he didn't have to. This place, it never let anyone leave. But I wasn't just anyone. I saw the journal then on the floor untouched by fire. The only real thing left. I grabbed it, and suddenly, the fire vanished. I was back, lying on the cold tiles of the abandoned Ward 13. The air was thick with dust, the distant hum of the hospital's working wings vibrating through the walls. No flames, no corpses, just silence. I gasped for breath, my hands shaking as I looked down at the old, leather-bound journal. And there, scrawled in the margins of the final entry, a new sentence, written in my own trembling handwriting. The fire never stopped. I slammed the book shut. Footsteps echoed in the distance, real ones. Dr. Sokolov? A voice, Maria, the night nurse. I turned toward the entrance of the ward, toward the safety of the hospital beyond. But before I left, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The hallway was empty. The room was dark. And yet, in the broken reflection of a shattered window, I swore I saw a figure. A man in a pristine white coat. Watching, waiting, smiling. And as I stepped through the doors, leaving Ward 13 behind, the lights flickered back on, as if they knew someone else would come. Eventually, the fire never stopped, and it never will.